being an infinitesimal part of the God's creation. How can we truly experience God? We can explain this with the analogy of a fire and the sparks which emanate from the fire. From the fire of the Nirguna Brahman, absolute self, a tiny spark of individuality emanates. This spark of individuality is referred as the I thought, the individual ego, or the jiva, or the mind. This gives rise to a sense of a separate, limited self. As this spark of individuality emanates from the fire, it simultaneously associates itself with the body and mind. This association of the ego with the body and mind is called as the ajnana, ignorance, which is the root cause of all of our suffering. The goal of the spiritual practice is to eradicate or remove this identification with the body and mind. Once this nature of the ego, the inclination to associate itself with objects, the body and mind, is destroyed, then the ego or the I thought naturally gets purer and purer. And once it is fully pure, then it naturally merges and subsides back into its source, which is the absolute self or the Nirguna Brahman. This is the way in which the ajnana or ignorance can be removed, and the way by which we attain oneness with the Supreme Being. In this example, the sparks at times they fly away from the fire, but the jiva or the individual ego is never apart or outside of the God's nature, God's existence, which is eternal and the very basis of all the existence. This example is not to say that the jiva and the God are two separate entities, or jiva is a kind of a piece of Supreme Being which has become apart. No, it is just to illustrate the appearance of the individuality, the individual ego or the jiva. It is basically a false notion or the illusion which is the issue here. The kind of limitation which we have is not basically enforced by the Supreme Being on us. It is something we ourselves have imposed on us, that we are finite, we are limited to this physical body, we are limited to the mind, whatever we can think of. So all these limitations of the body and mind is something which we have imposed on us on our own. So it is only by disassociating the ego with the body and mind with the practice of Mahayoga, one can easily makes the ego to remain as the aham or the I am, the pure awareness. So to the extent we can remain without unwanted thoughts, to the extent we can remain in the presence of Bhagavan, which is the sense of beingness which is there all the time within us, then to that extent the ego becomes more and more pure, and once the ego gets to be able to remain in the presence all the time, then what happens is that it merges and subsides back into the absolute being, the Nirguna Brahman, forever. So this is the way in which we need to understand this analogy. The individual ego or the jiva is basically a false notion. It is basically a kind of false imagination by which the eternal existence associates itself into a finite form. So as the ego gets dissolved, then its kind of true nature, which is basically identical with the Nirguna Brahman, is revealed. The jiva is basically a principle which is not eternal. It is just for a period of time. So this mistaken identification of the eternal self with the finite form is the jiva or the individual ego, and it is the very nature of the ego to always hold on to forms. It keeps changing from holding one form to another, and it grows by holding on to forms. When we go in the opposite direction, by not holding on to any forms, by not giving room to unwanted thoughts, by remaining in the presence of Bhagavan all the time, being in the sense of I am, the self-awareness, then what happens is that ego stays without any attachment to forms, to the body and mind, even though we may be functioning in the world with the required tools of the body and mind. So then what happens is that in due course of time with the practice, even though we may be using our body and mind for all the worldly activities, but still within, internally, we are keeping aloof and detached from reacting to the worldly objects. By not reacting to the objects that we perceive in the world, then what happens is naturally ego stays without holding too much onto the forms of this world. We are not holding on to the vishayas, the worldly objects. Then what happens is that the ego becomes more and more pure. Ego almost starts moving towards the I am, the pure awareness, which is the very basis of the ego. Ego is basically a combination of the pure awareness I am with the association of the body and mind. So as we remain without thoughts and remain in the presence of the I am, then what happens is naturally ego becomes more and more the I am, which is its basic principle, foundation, because we have left off the association with the body and mind. So thus, to the extent we remain as the true nature of the ego, which is basically the sense of I am, aham, self-awareness, then to that extent we naturally move towards the Nirguna Brahman, sense of I am, and what happens is that we then finally fully merges back into the Nirguna Brahman, thereby completely dissolving the ego, which is basically then identical with the Supreme Being, Atma, Nirguna Brahman. Arunachala Shiva, Arunachala Shiva, Arunachala Shiva.